What if the person you trusted most, the one you vowed to spend the rest of your life with, was hiding a secret so devastating it could shatter everything you believed about love, loyalty, and trust? What would you do if your perfect marriage was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion? This is the story of Claire, a young bride filled with dreams of a happily ever after, and Daniel, the man who promised her the world. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, a vision of love and devotion. But behind closed doors, Daniel harbored a secret that would turn their fairy tale into a nightmare. A secret so profound that when it came to light, it left a trail of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately, tragedy. Today, we delve into a tale of hidden lives and fractured trust, where the lines between love and deception blur, and the weight of unspoken truths becomes too much to bear. What happens when secrets unravel lives and betrayal pushes someone to the breaking point? This is a story you won't soon forget. Claire was the kind of woman who believed in fairy tales. Growing up in a small town, she'd always dreamed of the day she'd walk down the aisle, marry the love of her life, and begin the perfect chapter of her story. She wanted what every young bride wants: a husband who would love her unconditionally, a family built on trust, and a lifetime of shared dreams. When Claire met Daniel, it was as if her dreams were finally coming true. Daniel was everything she'd ever hoped for: handsome, charismatic, and endlessly charming. He seemed to embody the kind of stability and love that Claire had always longed for. Their courtship was fast but passionate, filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and promises of a bright future. To those around them, they were a picture-perfect couple. Daniel showered Claire with affection, and Claire was utterly devoted to him. Friends would often comment on how lucky they were to have found each other. But as perfect as Daniel seemed, there was something about him, a faint shadow of secrecy that Claire couldn't quite put her finger on. He rarely spoke about his past, brushing off questions with humor or vague answers. Claire didn't press him. She trusted him. After all, she believed that love was about accepting someone for who they were, not questioning every detail, and so she convinced herself that whatever he wasn't sharing didn't matter. They were happy, and that's all she needed to know. In less than a year, they were married in a ceremony that felt like it had been plucked from the pages of a romance novel. Claire, glowing with excitement, believed she was stepping into the life she'd always imagined. But beneath Daniel's warm smiles and tender gestures, a storm was brewing, a storm that neither of them could outrun. Claire would later look back on those early days and wonder how she had missed the signs, the small cracks in the perfect facade. But at the time, all she saw was love, and in love, she found comfort. What she didn't know was that Daniel's comfort came not from her, but from the secrets he worked so hard to hide. For a while, Claire convinced herself that the uneasy feelings in her heart were just a symptom of overthinking. Daniel's late nights, his frequent absences, the guarded way he answered her questions. She told herself it was all normal, that maybe he was just adjusting to married life, just as she was. But the doubts gnawed at her, growing louder with each passing day. It started with a small slip, one so insignificant that Claire almost missed it. A shirt in the laundry, stained with an unfamiliar cologne. Subtle but distinct. At first she brushed it aside, but something about it lingered in her mind. Then there were the phone calls. Daniel always seemed to step outside to take them, his voice dropping to a hush. When Claire asked, he would flash her a smile and say it was work. Always work. But it wasn't work. And deep down, she knew it. One evening, as Daniel stepped out for another work meeting, Claire found herself pacing the living room, torn between trusting her husband and confronting the uneasy truth. Her eyes drifted to his briefcase, left hastily on the coffee table. She told herself she wouldn't look, that she wasn't that kind of wife, but her hands betrayed her. Inside, beneath a stack of papers, she found it, a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, as though it had been read and reread many times. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The words on the page weren't meant for her. They were meant for someone else. The letter was from a man, and it spoke of love, of stolen moments, of promises to someday stop hiding. Claire's world began to tilt. Her breath quickened as she searched for more, desperate for some other explanation. But the more she found, text messages saved on his phone, photos buried deep in his drawers, the clearer the truth became. Daniel wasn't just hiding something, he was hiding a part of himself. When he came home that night, Claire was waiting. The letter sat on the table between them, a silent accusation. Daniel froze when he saw it, his face draining of color. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to spin a story. Instead, he sank into the chair across from her, his head in his hands. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And then, slowly, painfully, he began to tell her everything. He told her about Michael, the man he had been seeing for years, about how he had tried to suppress who he really was, how he had convinced himself that marrying Claire would make him normal, that it would fix him. Claire listened, her heart breaking with every word. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of betrayal, humiliation, and anger. How could he have done this to her? How could he have built their entire life on a lie? But even as her fury surged, she couldn't help but see the anguish in his eyes. Daniel wasn't just her betrayer. He was also a man trapped by his own fears, his own shame. "What are people going to think?" she asked, her voice shaking. She wasn't just worried about her own pain. She was terrified of the scandal, the whispers, the judgment that would come from their community. Daniel begged her not to tell anyone. He pleaded with her to keep his secret, to protect him from a world that wouldn't understand. And for a moment, she considered it. She loved him once, didn't she? Maybe some part of her still did. But Claire wasn't sure she could live with the weight of his secret. She wasn't sure she could live with the knowledge that her life, her marriage, had been a carefully constructed facade. As the tension in the room thickened, one thing became clear. Their perfect life was over, and what came next would change them forever. In the days that followed the confrontation, Claire's world unraveled further. She was a woman torn between rage and heartbreak, unable to reconcile the love she once felt for Daniel with the overwhelming betrayal she now carried. She barely slept, her mind replaying his words over and over again. The weight of his secret pressed down on her, suffocating her under its enormity. Daniel, too, was unraveling. The guilt of his double life consumed him. He tried to act normal, to salvage what little semblance of peace remained in their home. But he couldn't shake the sight of Claire's broken expression when she had confronted him. Worse still, he couldn't ignore the growing strain with Michael, who was growing impatient with the lies and the promises that never materialized. Michael wanted more of Daniel, more of a future that wasn't confined to stolen moments and whispered conversations. But Daniel, trapped between the life he had built with Claire and the life he wanted with Michael, felt paralyzed. Every decision seemed like a betrayal of someone he cared for. Claire tried to avoid Daniel, but their shared space made it impossible. Every glance, every moment of silence between them felt like a battle waiting to erupt. Daniel begged her to keep his secret, to protect his reputation and their public image. Claire, drowning in her anger and humiliation, couldn't decide what hurt more, the lie itself or the expectation that she would continue living it. One evening, the fragile tension between them finally snapped. Daniel returned home later than usual, his excuses mumbled and unconvincing. Claire had spent hours stewing in her thoughts, and when she saw him, something in her broke. She demanded answers, not just about where he had been, but about everything. Their marriage, his lies, and why he had chosen to ruin her life for the sake of his own secrecy. Daniel lashed back, his frustration boiling over. He accused Claire of not understanding, of not appreciating how hard it had been for him to live a life dictated by societal expectations. He shouted about his fear of being ostracized, about the suffocating pressure to be someone he wasn't. And then, in a moment of brutal honesty, he told her something she couldn't unhear, that he had never truly loved her the way a husband should love a wife. The words hit Claire like a physical blow. Everything inside her, all the pain, the anger, the betrayal, erupted in that instant. Her world went red. She didn't think. She didn't feel. She just acted. What happened next would haunt her forever. The details of the crime remain shrouded in chaos and emotion. Some say it was a moment of pure rage, a violent, uncontrollable response to the pain she had endured. Others suggest that Claire had already reached her breaking point days earlier, that the argument was simply the final push. But what is clear is that in that moment, everything changed. A life was lost, and Claire's world would never be the same. As the dust settled, the room fell silent. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Claire stood frozen, staring at what she had done, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no taking it back, no undoing the choices, the rage, or the pain that had led her here. And in that silence, the enormity of her actions began to sink in. Love, betrayal, and lies had brought them to this point, and now there was no way out. It didn't take long for the crime to come to light. A neighbor, startled by the shouting that echoed through the walls that night, had called the police. By the time they arrived, the scene was one of devastation, a marriage undone in the most violent of ways. Claire was found sitting on the floor, her face pale, her hands trembling. She didn't resist when the officers approached her. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't explain. It was as if the weight of what she had done had rendered her silent. But the evidence spoke loudly enough. It told a story of rage, betrayal, and heartbreak that no one could ignore. As the investigation unfolded, the secrets Daniel had fought so hard to keep hidden began to surface. Investigators uncovered letters and photographs, evidence of his relationship with Michael. Friends and colleagues who had once spoken of Daniel as a devoted husband were now whispering about the double life he had led. The revelation sent shockwaves through their small community, where whispers of scandal quickly grew into judgment and outrage. Claire, meanwhile, was unraveling under the weight of it all. During interrogations, she spoke of the betrayal she had felt, of the humiliation and anger that had consumed her. She described how her life had been built on lies, how the man she thought she knew had deceived her so completely. Her words painted a picture of a woman pushed to her emotional limits, a person consumed by grief and rage. But the law is not swayed by emotions alone. As the case moved to trial, the courtroom became a battleground. The defense argued that Claire had been driven to the brink by Daniel's lies, by the emotional torment of discovering his hidden life. They painted her as a victim, a woman whose actions, while tragic, were born from psychological distress. The prosecution, however, was unrelenting. They emphasized the irrevocable loss of life, the choices Claire had made in that moment of rage. To them, no amount of heartbreak could justify what she had done. They called witnesses to testify to her growing instability in the days leading up to the crime, her inability to let go of her anger and pain. Outside the courtroom, The public response was just as divided. Some saw Claire as a tragic figure, a victim of a world that had forced Daniel to live a lie. Others viewed her as a woman who had taken a life in an act of selfish vengeance. The societal stigma surrounding homosexuality only fueled the controversy, with many questioning whether Daniel's secrets had been as much a product of his own choices as of the world he had lived in. As the trial drew to a close, one thing became clear. There were no winners in this story. A man was dead, a woman's life was in ruins, and the truth of their marriage lay bare for all to see. The jury's decision would determine Claire's fate, but it couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. Love, betrayal, and tragedy had led them here, and now there was no turning back. This story is a haunting reminder of the devastating consequences of secrets, betrayal, and the societal pressures that force people to live lives that are not their own. Daniel's secret was born from fear, a fear of judgment, rejection, and a world that wouldn't accept him for who he truly was. But in trying to protect himself, he unwittingly created a life built on deception, one that ultimately unraveled with tragic consequences. Claire, too, was a victim, not just of Daniel's lies, but of a society that taught her to dream of a perfect life without preparing her for the complexities that love and relationships can bring. Her actions, though unforgivable, were the culmination of pain, anger, and humiliation. And now she must live with the weight of her choices for the rest of her life. In the end, the truth always surfaces, but at what cost? For Daniel, it was his life. For Claire, it was her freedom and the dreams of the life she had once envisioned. For both of them, it was the destruction of the love they had tried to create, no matter how imperfect or flawed it might have been. This story raises uncomfortable questions. How much of our pain comes from the lies we tell, and how much comes from the world that forces us to hide? How different might their story have been if Daniel had lived in a time or place where he could be true to himself without fear? And how do we, as a society, contribute to the tragedies that arise from silence and shame? If you found this story compelling, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories that delve into the human condition and the choices that define us. And let us know in the comments, what do you think could have changed the outcome of this story? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, remember, the truth has a way of coming out, whether we're ready for it or not.